Bridges.
Bridges or something. You know what I did? Oops.
It's okay. I gave them the real link.
You're on them.
It was written by the same guy.
You got a table on Hank?
No, you got it, Thomas Carter. This is Thomas Cooper.
Carter. Cooper.
Yeah.
Okay, Thomas Cooper.
No worries. Okay, so what we thought we would do at the beginning of this one, and this is for those of you who are watching online, is to give some of you the chance to ask some questions that you would have asked if you've been here in person. And Shannon will relay some of those questions to me. When we're done talking about some of those things, we'll be ready to move forward, and I'll talk some about undesigned coincidences. And yes, for those of you who have already seen my lectures on undesigned coincidences, I've got new ones. So there is something more to be seen here. So just bear with us. But Shannon, do you have any questions from the folks online there?
Not right this second.
If the question is, do you have a cold, Tim? The answer is yes.
Here. Okay, let me refresh this here. There you go.
Sure. Thank you.
Oh, no, who are you? Maybe they're
Okay.
furiously typing right now, trying to get it all out. We'll, nothing yet though.
All right. Let me first then give a little bit of the background on what the argument from undesigned coincidences is. But before I get into any details, I'll leave you all dangling, and I'll take any questions if there are any in from those folks at that point. How can you tell by looking at two different documents that both of them are credible? That's an interesting question. We all know that we can be fooled by a single document. People forge wills, and if you just take them at face value, you're a sucker because they've designed them to look like they're realistic. But is there any way that we can look at two different passages of Scripture and come to a reasonable judgment that they're both credible? At first you might say, well, you know, there are those places where they say almost the same thing in almost the same words, but of course there's a very simple skeptical response to that. The closer the resemblance is in wording, the greater the probability that one of these documents was copied from the other, or that they were both copied from some earlier document, maybe now lost. After all, when you read a story in the newspaper that you find rather shocking, there may be lots of things that you do to try to confirm it. What you do not do is go and buy another copy of the same newspaper to see whether it matches. You know it's going to match. They were printed from the same plates. Of course it's going to match. So simply telling the same story in the same words is not going to do the job. But there are places where we can see these incidental points of contact between two accounts in different books by different authors that do strongly indicate, especially in the aggregate, when we pull together lots of them, the credibility of these narratives. So here's one way that we can look at this. Let me give, well, I say I'm going to give an illustration, but let me hang on and see first, Shannon. Is there anybody who's thought up a question yet? Ah, well, you snooze, you lose. I'll launch it. In Matthew 14, we have the story of the death of John the Baptist. And as Matthew is building up to that story, he tells us Herod heard about the preaching of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist, whom I had killed. That's why he's come back from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him." And then he goes on and tells the story of how it came about that Herod had John killed, not entirely his intention, but it fell out that way with Salome dancing and all that. So, here's the question. Matthew is an erstwhile tax collector. Now that he has become a follower of Jesus, he's one of Jesus' inner circle of disciples. How does Matthew know what Herod Antipas is saying to his own servants in the privacy of his own castle? Now, we don't have to have an answer for that question. I don't know. Somehow he heard it, we could say. And that might be true. But in fact, we can get a very plausible answer to this if we look at Luke chapter 8, verse 3. Luke is not talking about the death of John the Baptist. He is not talking, in fact, about anything connected with the scene that Matthew is describing. He's enumerating the women who provided food for Jesus and his disciples during their ministry. And in the course of that, he names Joanna. And then he pauses and gives you just a parenthetical description of Joanna. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household steward. And it clicks. Jesus' followers had family in the highest ranks of Herod's service inside his own house. And now there's no mystery as to how Matthew could have gotten word about what Herod was saying to his servants. That is an example of an undesigned coincidence. Nobody who's not in the grip of a very strong ideology could say, well, Luke just put that in there to explain something that was said in Matthew, because we read what's said in Matthew, and unless you are looking at that with a very particular point of view, you don't even have it raised as a question. Until I asked you the question, it probably didn't occur to you. Nobody could reasonably say, Matthew put that in there because he was just making it up, and then Luke put this in his gospel, and he was just making it up, and it's an accident. Accidents happen, but that's not the way to bet on this. It looks like there's a coincidence that is not intended on either side. It's not something that either one of them is trying to do to make things come out right, but they coordinate in this fashion. And when we see that coordination, we realize, hey, wait, the reason these pieces fit together is that they're both talking about something drawn from life. They're up against the set of the facts, but each one of us tells us slightly different facts, and in this case, it just happens that we're lucky enough to see the connection between the two. Does that make sense? Everybody's follow that? So what I wanted to do was to give you some of the other minute, undesigned coincidences to show you how these things fit together. Let's first look at an instance of chronological consistency that I think everybody would agree is undesigned. Luke chapter 3, verse 1, we were looking at this before. It starts out, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, the reign of Tiberius Caesar could be dated from 12 or from 14, but on coins, it's celebrated from the 12th year. Let's go, or AD 12. Let's go with that. So, the 15th year of Tiberius after 12. What year is that? Well, who's writing? It's Luke writing, but he's writing to an audience of Christians, and many of them are Jews. So either he means take 12 and add 15, or he means take 12 and add 14 plus some of the 15th, which would be the Jewish reckoning, that would be 15. Where does that put us? That puts us at reckoning from AD 12, when Tiberius assumed the co-regency. This would take us to sometime in the year 26 or the year 27. Can't get any more precise than that. Let's not try. But that's the time at which John comes baptizing in the wilderness. Now look over at John chapter 2, where Jesus, after the miracle at Cana, goes in and for the first time cleans out the temple. And the Jews say, by what authority do you do this? How does Jesus respond? Destroy this temple. I will raise it up in 3 days. He has something very specific in mind. But they don't get it. They think he's talking about the bricks and mortar temple. So what do they say to him in response? Do you remember what they say? Let's look it up. It's in John chapter 2, verse 20.
20-something years it took to build this temple, or whatever it says.
Yeah, but it's important that we get the exact number right, okay? Here's what they say. John chapter 2, verse 20. The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" 46 years. Well, what date would that put this event at? If we go into Josephus, we find that the year that Herod the Great began the building of the temple was either 19 or 18 BC. Let's take 18 BC, okay? If it was 18 BC, then the year 28 BC would be 46 years later. The year 27 to 28 would be 45 years plus a part of a year, which is undoubtedly the way the Jews would have used the number. Do you see the point of coordination here? We've got the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, and it puts us in the zone of 26 to 27, right? We take, and that's John, we take this from the Jews, and it puts us around 27 or 28 at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, which is just a little bit after the ministry of John. Does anyone think that John read that verse in Luke and then said, now I got to find some really indirect way of making it seem like I know what I'm talking about, and did the math and came up with that? Or does it look like this is something the Jews would say to fling in Jesus' face? What? It's been 46 years. You're going to do it in 3 days. Right there. No. Of course not. This is not a case where one writer is copying from the other, or where both are copying from some common underlying document. And yet, to as much precision as we have any right to expect from something that is as unstudied and unartificial as this, we get the dates corresponding. That's an example of an undesigned coincidence. Let's take another example. We talked about Malchus's ear being cut off. John chapter 18 gives us the name. Peter draws a sword, right? He's going to defend his Lord. He cuts off the ear of the high servant. Jesus says, put away your sword. That's not what we're here for. And sort of all of Jesus' followers run away. In John 18:36, Pilate asks Jesus, are you a king? And what does Jesus say? It's important not to just go fuzzy. Well, there was a flannel graph thing, and there was a Pilate and a Jesus, and they had some conversation. We need details. He says, if my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. I don't know what the playground rules were like in the first century exactly, but it does seem to me that cutting off somebody's ear would count as fighting. So why hasn't Jesus just walked into the punch here? Why isn't this something? Well, your servants are fighting. High priest's servants come in with his ear cut off. Says one of your guys did it. Why is Jesus not just inviting contradiction on its face? Well, go over to Luke chapter 22, verse 51, and you have the rest of the story, as they used to say. When Peter had done this, and Jesus told him to put up his sword, he healed the servant with a touch. To say your servants were fighting, you have to have evidence. Here's the evidence. Look, the guy's ear is missing. But it's not. You see how that fits together? And yet, Luke doesn't mention the conversation with Pilate, and John doesn't mention the healing. But you put the two together, and you see this in stereoscopic vision. It pops out at you. This kind of argument and this kind of evidence, they gain strength as you see multiple examples. So I can go on with lots more, but are you guys trying to flag me back there for something, or are we good?
No, you do have a question.
I have a question. Wait, there's a question. All right, we now pause for a word from someone who has a question. I love questions. Go for it.
Marianne Spikes asks, any plans to write a book on undesigned script? Yes, you can refer to many older works in the footnotes.
Oh, wow, that makes it all okay. I have thought about it, and Marianne, you are not the first person to be asking me. So I have a lot of people who have requested that, and I'm thinking about it. I'll tell you what, why don't you hear me out for the rest of this talk and tell me if you think it's worth putting together into something like that. Maybe I'll do that. Or how about this? Here's a counter offer, Marianne. If I write something, how about I just write something on the Gospels and I get to put together undesigned coincidences and the other incidental historical information, so I get to sort of pile it all up into one book. Do you like that? Is that going to be okay? So you can chat back there with Shannon and let me know if you would accept that as an alternative. Okay, so we had a question. Now, any follow-ups on that, or not right?
No, not right now.
You got to type faster, Marianne. We're going to move on, but we'll catch you after the next one. Here's another one. Mark 14, verses 35 and 36. And for those of you who've seen some of what I've done on this subject before, I hope you appreciate the fact that I am really trying not just to repeat the examples I've used before. I do have lots of other examples, but these are all fresh ones. Mark 14, 35 and 36. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and notice what he says. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet, not what I will, but what you will. Very touching scene. Now, go over to John chapter 18. We don't get those words, right? They go off across the Kidron Valley, and John skips right away to the betrayal. He doesn't give us the Garden of Gethsemane. So he can't give us the same story in the same words. But do you notice this just happens, flickers by. If you were just reading John, you probably wouldn't notice this if you hadn't been primed for it. But do you notice what he says after Peter cuts off Malchus's ear? Jesus says, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? Do you see what's on his mind here? He's used in his earnest prayer this metaphor of the cup to drink, and it's not a good thing. It's a bitter cup to drink. Luke tells us about the prayer. He doesn't tell us about the comment to Peter. John tells us the comment to Peter that comes very shortly thereafter. Doesn't tell us about the prayer. But in both cases, there's a metaphor that's in Jesus' mind. I don't think you can reasonably say that either author is copying from the other. There's just not enough overlap there. But there's a kind of resonance there where the same thought is on his mind. One more example of the kind of ring of truth that we get in these accounts. They're different people. They select different details, but they fit together, sometimes in very surprising ways. Here's another one, Luke chapter 22. There's a rather embarrassing scene in Luke. Chapter 22, verse 27. Jesus asks them, who is the greater? One who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as one who serves. What does that mean? Read back through Luke, you won't find the answer. Jesus is the rabbi. He's the one in charge. He's the one who tells them what to do. You are not going to find out what is meant by I am among you as one who serves. But look at the scene of the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, chapter 13. Some of you know your gospel well enough to know what I'm going for here, right? Look at John chapter 13. Right? It's just before the Feast of the Passover that all these things have happened that Jesus has talked about. Probably it was just before the Passover, should go with chapter 12. When Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, and here's where I'm going to show you why this is really the same Passover supper as we get in Luke chapter 22. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured the water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel. He's serving them right there. Luke doesn't mention what Jesus was doing. John doesn't mention his saying, I am among you as one who serves. But what we're told in John, an extra detail, Luke doesn't deny it, he just doesn't include it, dovetails with Jesus' comment in Luke, I am among you as one who serves. It gives it the context. It gives us the backstory for it. It fills in what we can't understand from reading Luke alone. But why did Jesus wash their feet? It says he loved his disciples, he loved them to the end. Well, there's lots of ways you can display love. Why foot washing of all of the different things that you might have done? It's what servants did. And maybe that would be enough. Maybe we could say Jesus is acting as a servant. That was a good thing for him to do. But the motivation for his doing that is not apparent in John. It just comes out of nowhere. And Jesus rose and he did this thing. But let's go back to Luke chapter 22, because not only does John explain Luke, but Luke explains John. This is a twofer. If you go back into Luke 22, and you look not at verse 27 where we were before, but go backwards 3 verses. Look at Luke 22:24. A dispute arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And Jesus has a problem. Here we are, he's about to be crucified, and they're bickering about who's going to be the greatest. There is a need for a clear, memorable lesson here. And Jesus delivers that clear, memorable lesson by rising, setting aside his outer garment, putting a towel around his waist, and washing their feet. The object lesson was occasioned by their disputing about greatness. And Jesus has to change their understanding of what it means to be great. The comment about his being among them as one who serves is a reference to what he's just done. But Luke doesn't tell about the washing of the feet. It's the missing link that connects all of these things together. That isn't copying, because if it were copying, we'd have it all in one of the sources. That's the kind of intersection of undesigned coincidence that we find, that interlocking like puzzle pieces that snap together, and it's not by staring just at this one or staring just at that one that you see what's going on. It's by fitting them together, and then suddenly you see a bigger part of the picture than you ever saw before. That's that example of an undesigned coincidence. So you may say, this is great stuff. Can we do this outside of the Gospels? Yes, we can. Let me take you outside of the Gospels and give you some examples elsewhere. Let's start with 1 Corinthians 1:12. What impression do we get from 1 Corinthians 1:12? Each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Whoa, hey, I'm a winner, right? Now, that suggests, though it doesn't state quite outright, that Apollos had been there in the city at some point preaching, possibly after Paul had left. If you go over to 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6, you get the chronology nailed down a little better. I planted, Apollos watered, but God brought the increase. That makes it pretty clear. Paul was there first. Apollos came along subsequently. And the state of the church as it is now is due to God's blessing on the work of both of these guys. What do we find in the book of Acts? Go over to Acts chapter 18. Acts 18:1. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. So Paul is in Corinth, right? But then, what do we find in 18:24? Now, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. Not Corinth yet, but Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, that's where Corinth is. The brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. So he goes with letters commending him to them, right? When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. But it doesn't say Corinth, it just says Achaia. It's not quite clear. Hey, read one verse into chapter 19. And it happened that while Apollos was at Corinth, okay, he really was at Corinth specifically. So Acts confirms by its telling of the story from one point of view, something that we find in Paul's epistle to the Corinthians from some stray references Paul makes that tie up his time there and Apollos' time there in a chronological sequence. Do you see how those fit together? Most people accept, almost all scholars accept, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians as authentic epistles of Paul. But many scholars doubt the direct accuracy of the book of Acts. Now, I think that they need to get in touch with Craig Keener. But as a substitute for that, I'll take the undesigned coincidences that show how well these things are integrated. By the way, did you notice what Paul said over in 1 Corinthians when he was protesting about the Corinthians not accepting him and accepting his word here now? He says two things. He says, and this is just kind of funny, my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom. I'm not a great speaker. Oh, well, I wonder what could have provoked him to say that. So Apollos is a man mighty in words. He's eloquent, and now there's divisions of the church where there's an Apollos faction and a Paul faction. It's not all about words, you people. And one more thing. Do you remember one other thing that Paul says? When I came to you, did I need letters of recommendation like some people bring? Oh, who might that be a reference to? Paul's a little defensive, and he's saying, look, I came to you with spirit of power, but not with compelling words. But I'm an apostle. I don't need letters of recommendation. You don't have to receive me because you take somebody else's word for it. I'm one of the apostles. Just an interesting set of connections there with Acts 18 and 19. Here's another one, Galatians 1. Paul's telling the story of his conversion, briefly and for a particular purpose. But in the course of telling it, he says that he's in Jerusalem for a short time. After 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, Peter, and remained with him 15 days. Now, this is Paul's first big chance to hang with the people who were the disciples of Jesus during his earthly ministry. Why 15 days? Why not stick around for half a year, absorb as much as you can, learn all that you can? There's no answer. He just gives us the number, 15 days, and he's out of there. There's no more explanation. But if we look at Acts chapter 22, verse 18, we can see why he had to leave. People were designing to take his life. Remember, Jerusalem's where Paul had been persecuting the church. Now he's turned and he's over to the other side. He is not a popular guy. And so there are designs on his life and he's got to leave. That explains why he stays only 15 days, but he doesn't say that here. You've got to go to Acts 22 to pick that bit up. Again, neither of these can plausibly be said to be copied from the other. Luke doesn't mention the exact duration of the stay. Paul doesn't mention the reason of leaving. Put the two together, 3D. It comes out. You can see it. Let's do one more. At 1 Thessalonians Chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 and 6. Paul clearly loves these Christians at Thessalonica, and he was very concerned about them. When we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in the faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we are destined for this. Right? And then in verse 6, again, but now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love, and reported that you always remember us kindly and long to see us as long as we see you, for this reason, in all our distress and affliction, we have been comforted about you and through your faith. Now that seems to indicate that Paul went to Athens, and Timothy was sent, instead of going to Athens, to Thessalonica. What do we find in the book of Acts? Book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 14 and 15, we find Timothy's left at Berea, not at Thessalonica, but at Berea, when Paul was escorted in haste to Athens. Luke's not told us in the book of Acts why Timothy was left behind. We have to figure that out by reading what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians. It's because instead of going down south to Athens, he's supposed to go back eastward a short bit to Thessalonica. Why to Thessalonica? Because troublemakers from Thessalonica have come over to Berea pursuing Paul. Paul's got to be gotten out of the way. But he's so concerned that their presence here may indicate they've done some mischief back there to the church in Thessalonica that he tells Timothy, go back there and find out what's going on, and then meet up with me again in Athens and tell me what's going on. So find out, come back. But we don't get that commissioning of Timothy to go and do that there. But everything in Acts is consonant with it. They're in Berea. Paul winds up in Athens alone. Timothy joins him later. But we find out what the purpose was of that and what Timothy was doing in the meantime by looking at the epistle to the Thessalonians. Does that make sense? Shannon, do we have any more questions back there, or are we all?
No, we got a thumbs up from Bethany, though.
Yay! Hi, Bethany.
From Mary Ann, they both said they would absolutely accept it.
They would accept that compromise on the book. Okay, well then, that's almost a done deal. I'll get back to you when I actually have some spare time for writing. Sometime between midnight and 3 in my daily schedule is probably when that's going to happen. No, I'll see what I can do. There are also undesigned coincidences in the Old Testament. I'm just going to give you one example of this, but there's a whole book full of more if you want. It's called Undesigned Coincidences. The author is John James Blunt. J.J. Blunt. And you can find this book, Undesigned Coincidences. Eric Lounsbury has recently put out a modern edition of it. I think he retypeset the whole thing. I have thought sometimes about doing an edition of Blunt where I've got some editorial notes on it, but most of the book is taken up with Old Testament examples. So this is just one sample. You like it? Get the book. It's free online if you want it free online. If you want a copy to hold in your hands, you can get a copy on Amazon from Eric Lounsbury. See if you can find the edition he did. Here's an example. Genesis 24:24. searching for a bride for Isaac. What do we find? When the camels had finished drinking, I'll start at verse 22. The man took a gold ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels and said, "Please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." All right, so it goes here, Nahor, who is Abraham's brother. Bethuel, Rebekah. So we've got 3 generations listed, right? But Isaac is just the 2nd generation down, right? Abraham and Nahor are brothers. Isaac's in the same generation as Bethuel. They're cousins. Rebekah's a generation further along. There would seem to be a generational mismatch as far as those 2 are concerned. And right here locally, that's just left unexplained. But what do we find when we go back to Genesis chapter 18, right? We all remember there was something about Isaac, right? Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah, so she laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Am I going to get pregnant now? In other words, there was something very special about Isaac, which was that he was born after you would expect someone to be in that generation to be born, which puts him down in the right generation, to be of the same generation as Rebekah. You see how that fits together? It's all in one work. You could try to say, the author of Genesis very, very carefully put that in there to give it a ring of authenticity. I'm sorry, the modern historical novel was not invented back then. People didn't try to do these kinds of things. You've got to come forward as somebody like Daniel Defoe to see that kind of painstaking attention to detail. These are artless comments dropped in by the way. Her genealogy is not given to us so that we'll connect it with that thing. It's just sent in the way. You can find something similar with Moses' parents. Look up what generation Jochebed is from. Turns out that if you were just counting by generation, she would have been much older than her husband. But, in fact, she was born earlier and he was born late, and so things line back up again. Except that time it's the woman who would be older, except that things adjust again in that way. There are lots more in the Old Testament. Tole lege, as Augustine says, take up and read. And I think you will find that there's a lot of really wonderful stuff of this kind. At this point, my voice is running out, so what I want to do is I want to give you a chance to ask any questions you like. I could give a few more examples if you wanted them, and then we'll close it off. And if anybody if Bethany or Marianne has any more questions, Shannon will relay. You got one, Shannon?
Yeah.
Let's give them first dibs.
Off topic. She wants to know about your personal testimony.
My personal testimony.
She says, related to apologetics, giving a reason for the hope within, and forgive me if you already spoke to this today, but would you mind sharing a little bit of your personal testimony? I've heard you mention it briefly in passing a bit before, but would love to hear a little fuller summary if time allows. Thank you so much for your time. Now, speaking of time, we're going to have to wrap it up at 4:30 so that we can break everything down and kind of respect the church.
Okay, let me just speak to that. So a request for sort of my testimony as it relates to apologetics. In one sense, there's maybe less of interest here than you might have hoped for. I was raised in a Christian home by godly parents. My father was a Bible college professor, and so from my youth upward, I have been trained in Christianity and known it and loved it. I don't have a story of a wild, rebellious youth to tell. I am one of those for whom the rejoicing in heaven will be comparatively restrained. But I did go through the period in late high school and early college when I wanted to know all that I've been taught. Is it true? And I was given various responses. One of the responses was that an administrator at that Bible college forbade his son to speak to me because I was in the library late on Friday nights trying to read Kerygma and Myth by Bultmann to see whether there was anything here I needed to deal with. And I was off the beaten path, so I was not viewed as suitable company for some people. I was also told, as sometimes still young people are told, just to believe, or to start with Christianity, the standard presuppositional idea that you must start with the assumption that God exists and the Bible is His Word, and if you don't start with that, then you won't end with that, and you'll miss the boat. That did not seem to me to be a very compelling line of reasoning, and in fact, that really nonplussed me, and if that had been all that I had been given, things might have turned out very differently. But in the mercy of God, I discovered solid historical evidences, and those historical evidences did for me what I needed at that time. They gave me an anchor, and I looked at that and I said, here, by the same standards I would apply to any other document, I can establish the historical trustworthiness of these records. I knew enough about philosophy to know that Hume's critique of miracles was not persuasive, but I decided I wanted to learn more, so I became a philosopher. Went into philosophy, studied philosophy intensively, did a PhD in theory of knowledge, spent my time writing in epistemology and the philosophy of science up until the early years of the 21st century, around 2003, I believe. Some friends got in touch with me and they said, you know, there's this attack on the historical case for Christianity written by a very well-known Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga. We think there's something wrong with his attack, but he's making use of probability and we can't really, we can follow it to some extent, but we can't really diagnose it. Would you take a look at it? And I said, sure. So I looked at Plantinga's argument that all this historical evidence stuff really can't do very much, but that's okay because it's all brought home to you directly by the operation of the Holy Spirit. So it doesn't matter that the historical evidence fails. And I analyzed it and I found the exact point at which there was no longer a P under any of the shells. Not that I think Plantinga was doing that deliberately, I think he just got confused. And so I wrote a critique of that, and that brought me back into the circle of apologetics and rekindled the interest which I'd always had, but which I hadn't been indulging in a serious and systematic way for some years because I had been focused on the kinds of things that one does in a career in philosophy. And that was just before I discovered some of the richness of these older works of apologetics, and once I discovered that, I've really been in serious research mode on this material and wanting to bring it to a wider public and sort of like Thomas Cooper, to help other people to see the answers that I could wish had been available to me when I had my questions. Because I know that it would have shortened the learning curve for me. It would have saved me some time. And so what I wish I'd been able to find at that time that didn't exist in the fullness that I wanted, at least not to my knowledge, I'd like to make available to other people now. So that's about all there is to say. Any other questions here? Patrick.
First, are you familiar with King Aretas of Damascus? Have you studied him at all?
Yeah, right. Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. Yeah, Josephus talks about him in the Antiquities, book 18, and the border war that he started with Herod Antipas. He had his daughter had married Herod Antipas, and it was when Antipas fell in love with his half-brother Philip's wife that he made an agreement. He would divorce her, she would divorce Philip, and then they'd marry each other. So she ran home to Daddy, and Daddy was about as happy about that as you might expect. And since he shared a border with Herod Antipas, he began a border war that went on, and Josephus tells us some details about that. But there's probably a specific reason that you're asking this question.
I've looked into it very limitedly and found that he's supposed to be the one that was king of Damascus when Paul fled.
Right.
And I just didn't know if you had any further information on when he might have reigned, just to help.
Yeah, he had a long reign, and in the end, he was actually in open war with Antipas, and the Romans were going to intervene, but the Caesar at that time, I forget which Caesar it was, died, and so that kind of put a damper on that. But yeah, he had quite a long reign, and it's entirely consonant with what Paul says in 2 Corinthians, I believe, about having to flee from Damascus. So the historical details do line up there. I can get you more on that. I don't have an exact set of dates in my mind, but I do know that much at least is completely consistent with what we know from other sources.
Okay, great. The second question was on, I've met a skeptic who, just in passing, I asked him what he thought of the Gospels. And I didn't ask any follow-up questions. He just said that he thought it was just pure propaganda.
Okay, so the Gospels are propaganda.
Yeah, what do you do with that claim?
Right. Let's talk about propaganda.
Sure.
Okay? If we define propaganda as something written by people who think that what they have to say is very important and who hope that you will come to believe it too, then a physics textbook is propaganda. And something's wrong with that definition, right?
Yeah.
I mean, immediately when we say, oh, if we're just going to define it that broadly, then we have a problem. Let's see if we can narrow it down. Propaganda is not just something written by people who think it's important and hope you'll believe that it's true. It's something more than that. Propaganda is writing that is tendentious in the sense that it skews the facts by presenting what they want you to accept in a more favorable light than is really warranted by the historical facts that actually went down. Okay, that'll do for the claim. Now let's look at the Gospels, and so as not to lose ourselves in too wide a field, let's look at the Gospel of Mark, and let's see if that holds up. What do you find in Mark 14:31? What are the disciples, who are, by that time, the leaders in the church? They're the big names. What do you find them doing? They're bickering among each other as to who's to be the bravest of all. Who's going to be the one who, even if all forsake you, I will never abandon you. Right? They're boasting. This doesn't look good. And it especially doesn't look good when you move on down to verse 50 of Mark 14. And you find that they're all cowards. Right? They all fled. Does that look like propaganda? Well, let's go further. They're stupid, right? John 6:52. What are we? Sorry, Mark, not John. Mark 6:52. Let's look it up. So he says Jesus just walked on water, and they're all terrified. And then he gets in the boat, and he's like, "Yeah, no problem. I can calm the storm." And they were utterly astounded. Wait, this is a guy who just fed the 5,000 with a few loaves and fishes. You don't think he can work miracles? You're astounded? What's wrong with you? And in fact, Mark drives that point home. For they did not understand about the loaves. Whoa, you guys are not too bright, right? So they're boastful, they're cowardly, they're stupid, they're incompetent. What do we find in Mark, because I'll stick in Mark for this, 9, verse 18. The demon-possessed kid, this guy brings him to Jesus. He says whenever it seizes him, it throws him down and foams. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. Propaganda? This is not like a photo shoot for Peter and James and John. These are the guys. Look to them. They got it. This is, oh my gosh, are you the disciples or are you the Marx brothers? Right? They're just not very good. And finally, the crowning thing of all, in Mark 16, they are absent without leave on the morning of the resurrection. He says, Son of Man must go and be killed, and after 3 days he will rise again, and they miss it. They're not there. Who's there? Women. People of low social status in Jewish society. People whose testimony is of dubious worth in courts of law. Many sources say that they just don't count as much as a man. Maybe as much as a slave. You wouldn't put women there at the tomb if the disciples could be put at the tomb and you were writing propaganda. Come on. So there's 5 points, and I can give you a bunch more if you like, but just from the Gospel of Mark, which many people will say, oh, that's the earliest one, and maybe it is. But 5 places where it just doesn't line up with the propaganda narrative. That's not going to fly. This is not what propaganda would look like if they had been writing propaganda. Now, some people may be unreasonable enough just not to see it. You know, as Jesus used to say, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, here's the evidence. Is that a fair answer to your question?
That's very good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I think we're going to shut it down now because we've got to get out of here in 10 minutes or so to make sure we can break down all the tables. So, Shannon, unless there's any more online questions. All right. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. Thank all of you who came. I appreciate your attention during this long day.
Hey, there's going to be food at Matt's house. They've got a lot of barbecue, so please come and eat. And we're going to break down here, and then we're going to caravan over there if anybody doesn't know how to get there. So I'll be driving Matt's car over there. So please follow us over there, eat some barbecue, enjoy some fellowship. We won't be breaking bread. We'll be breaking barbecue.
All righty.
How did Planting respond to your critique?
Let's just say he wasn't very happy, but he acknowledged that his critique didn't do what he initially thought it would do.
Do you like him?
You know, Planting, I've got mixed.
He can complicate a blank page for sure. But
yeah, in some ways, I think he's a very great man, and a lot that I know about him strongly indicates that he's a very good man. That he has taken a lot of care and concern for his Christian students. But when it comes to epistemology, I think he's wrong, and I think he's importantly wrong. And sort of like Paul with Peter.
Because he's presuppositional? And he kind of is, he doesn't.
It's not quite presuppositional, and he would disavow it, but
Theologically speaking,